there's a question, a quiet question, hanging in the air like dust over ruins. A question the whole world, in its endless noise, tries hard to avoid. Because answering it takes more than just being brave. It means we have to look in the mirror and not turn away. It's a question that, when said out loud, doesn't just echo in empty hallways, but shakes us to our core. It cracks the foundations of what we're sure about, and makes the truth, or what we thought was the truth, hurt. A sharp pain reminding us how fragile our stories are. Is Hamas a terrorist group? The answer seems simple, written in headlines and angry speeches. But if we stop to breathe, another question pops up from the first one's shadow. Or is Hamas just a brutal reflection, the sure result of the world that made it? A symptom of the sickness, not the sickness itself. In our moral talk, we save the word terror for the clear act, for the explosion that shocks and destroys in a flash. But we never, or almost never, use that same word to describe the act of someone who oppresses. The slow, constant oppression that chokes lives for generations, that poisons hope and turns a people into prisoners in their own land. Which violence is louder, the one that explodes or the one that silences? And the line between fighting back and being savage, between a freedom fighter and a wild person, where is it drawn? It's not in the sand, based on universal rules. That line is drawn with the ink of power, by the hand of those who control the maps, the microphones, and the history books. It's a moving line, which shifts to make sense of the power of those who define it. That's why what we call truth is often just the view of the winner. It's the story told from the top of the mountain, not from the bottom of the valley. But the full truth, the human truth, doesn't live in the extremes. It breathes in the gray areas, in the contradictions, in the questions we're afraid to ask. And it's to these places we need to look now. The modern story of this land starts with a plan, drawn on paper far away. In 1947, the United Nations suggested splitting Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish, a solution that, in theory, promised a future. But the lines on the map didn't show the heavy history they carried. A year later, in 1948, the Western world celebrated Israel's birth. For a people who had gone through the darkness of the Holocaust, it was more than just a nation. It was a dream that had come true after thousands of years. A redemption, a safe place, finally found. A symbol of strength and triumph against unbelievable horror. But every miracle has a cost, and every story has more than one side. Creating a homeland for one people meant another people lost their homeland. The joy of those arriving was a sharp contrast to the pain of those leaving. The war that followed the Declaration of Independence redrew the map not with ink, but with fire and fear. Villages that had been there for centuries were emptied, some wiped out completely. 700,000 Palestinian families were torn from their homes, their lands, their lives. They became scattered. They were pushed into refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and the West Bank, waiting for a return that never came. They turned to dust. They became exiles. They became nobodies. An identity stuck in time, defined by what was missing. The West, watching from afar, used cold, clean words. They called it population transfer, territorial reorganization. But for Palestinians, the experience had a gut-wrenching name, a name that still echoes in every family today. They called it Nakba, the catastrophe. It wasn't just one event, but the start of a never-ending process of being moved and losing things. And under the dust of that first silence, under the weight of clashing stories, a wound was born, an open wound in the shared memory of a people that never healed. To understand the root of a conflict, it's not enough to just look at maps or agreements. You have to look inside the mind. Social psychology gives us a powerful way to do this, explaining how our surroundings shape how we act in deep and lasting ways. When a whole generation, and then another, and another, grows up under the constant shadow of a siege, something big changes. Violence in this situation stops being a careful choice among many options. It becomes a first reaction, almost an instinct to survive, forged in the fire of constant hardship. Shared trauma is a wound that won't heal. It doesn't just destroy buildings, streets, and roads. Its deepest damage is invisible. It destroys the feeling of a future. Hope, which is what drives human progress, becomes an impossible luxury. When the future is only filled with uncertainty and loss, the ability to dream, to plan, to build a life beyond tomorrow simply disappears. The future stops being a promise and just becomes another threat. Think about it. A child born in Gaza or in any constant conflict zone inherits not just their parents' DNA, but also the weight of their painful memories. They don't grow up with the normal worries of childhood. Their growth isn't guided by the idea of living with all its fullness and potential. Their existence is defined by another word: surviving. Every day is a risk calculation, a forced lesson in toughness. The very idea of normal is something they don't get to have. And when the basic act of living, with dignity, safety, and freedom, is always denied, the human mind looks for desperate ways out. Death, which for most is the end to avoid, can be seen differently. In a place where life means suffering and shame, dying can turn into a twisted way of having control, a last act of protest, a sad way to exist. Given this psychological truth, the question that everyone talks about seems wrong. The question shouldn't be, why is Hamas, or any group born from such conditions, violent? The more honest, and maybe more uncomfortable question is another. How did the world watching a pressure cooker being built for decades expect the explosion, when it came, not to be violent? The West runs the biggest empire of the 21st century, the story. Propaganda became a science, and talking, a product. A terrorist is someone who challenges the system. A hero is someone who serves it. Like Coca-Cola marketing, everything seems sweet, because the bitter part was hidden. But what's more terroristic? The rocket that blows up a building, or the blockade that kills children without medicine? Israel was born from trauma, and trauma, when it becomes policy, creates the survivor's complex. To not be wiped out, I must dominate. But fear, when it becomes a belief, turns victims into oppressors. Hamas is Israel's reflection. Israel is Hamas's reflection. One can't exist without the other. Both are products of the same pain, the same mirror, broken, reflecting the same fear, on opposite sides. Meanwhile, humanity watches. With pick-and-choose empathy, we cry for some and ignore others. The UN talks. The media hides things, and the civilized world stays uncaring. Maybe the real terror isn't in Gaza or Jerusalem, but in our moral numbness. If one side kills in the name of defense, and the other kills in the name of freedom, who is right? Morals are a tool of power, and whoever labels someone a terrorist decides what the world can feel. Is Hamas a terrorist group? Or is it just a sign of global hypocrisy? And what would we do if we had been born under the same rubble? There are no easy answers. History, at its core, has no heroes, only survivors, and wounds that time by itself doesn't heal. Maybe what we call terrorism is just the desperate cry of those who have been silenced for too long.
Defining the enemy is the first act of power. Questioning who defined them is the first act of freedom.